That's it then. The Germans are leaving the Ukraine. What does this mean? It means that some will flee, whereas others will remain in the city to come face to face with its new, uninvited and unpredictable guests. And it means that some will inevitably die. If those who flee the city don't die, who then will? Dying not child's play. It was the unmistakable voice of Colonel Tours, confusing his R's and his L's as always. He had suddenly appeared from nowhere in Alexei Turbin's dream. Tours was very strangely attired. He was wearing a coat of chainmail, with a gleaming helmet on his head, and he was leaning on a sword, the sort of long sword that had not been part of the weaponry of any army since the Crusades. Behind him hovered an aura of heavenly, radiant light. "Are you in paradise, Colonel?" asked Turbin, a tremulous feeling of ecstasy coursing through his body, the sort of feeling experienced only in dreams. "In paradise," Tours answered in a pure, totally transparent voice, like a stream in an urban forest. "That's very strange," said Turbin. "I always thought that paradise was simply a dream, and that's a very weird-looking uniform. May I ask, Colonel, whether you have retained your officer status in paradise?" "The colonel's in the brigade of crusaders now, Doctor," observed Sergeant Major Zhilin, someone who Turbin knew for certain had been killed in 1916 in the fighting around Vilna, together with his squadron of Belgrade hussars. The sergeant major towered up like a medieval hero, and his armour radiated light. His somewhat coarse features, which were extremely familiar to Dr. Turbin, as he had been personally responsible for bandaging Zhilin's lethal wound, were now unrecognisable, and the sergeant major's eyes were just like those belonging to Tours, pure, bottomless, and shining with an inner light. Above all else, Alexei Turbin's melancholy heart loved female eyes. Oh yes, the Lord God had wrought a piece of magic when he had created a woman's eyes. But they were nothing like Sergeant Major Zhilin's eyes. "And how about you?" Turbin asked curiously, with a sense of unaccountable joy. "You're in paradise, and yet you're wearing boots and spurs, so that means you've got horses, carts, pikes here." "Believe me, Doctor," said Sergeant Major Zhilin in his deep, resonant bass voice, warming the heart with the expression in his light blue eyes as he looked directly at the doctor. "The whole squadron's there in cavalry formation, and we've got our accordion. It's all a little awkward, it's true. Everything's spotlessly clean, you know. Church floors." "Well, what happened?" asked Turbin, impressed. "Well, the Apostle St. Peter is waiting for us. He's an old man in civvies, but dignified and courteous. I report our arrival, of course. The 2nd Squadron of Belgrade Hussars has safely made it to paradise, and so on and so forth. Where would you like us to be? There I am reporting our arrival, but all the time I'm thinking—" The sergeant major put his hand to his mouth and coughed modestly. "I'm wondering what he, St. Peter, is going to say. Perhaps he's going to tell us to go to the devil. You see, as you can probably understand, it's a question of what to do with the horses, and then—" The sergeant major scratched the back of his neck in embarrassment. "And then, between us, there's the women who waylaid us on the way. That's what I tell St. Peter, anyway. But I wink at the lads as if to say, we'll get rid of the women for the time being, and then we'll see. They can go and wait behind the clouds for a bit, and then we'll see how things work out. St. Peter may be his own master, but he's a positive sort of person. His eyes open wide, and I can see that he has spotted the women on the carts. Their shawls, of course, are clearly visible a mile off. Here's a pretty kettle of fish, I think. It's curtains for the whole squadron. 'Aha,' he says, shaking his head. 'So you've got some women with you, have you?' 'Yes, sir,' I say. 'But please don't be concerned, Mr. Apostle, sir. We'll box them on the ears at once.' 'No, you won't,' he says. 'You keep your hands to yourselves.' So, what are we to do now, eh? He's a kind-hearted old man, but as you can understand yourself, Doctor, a cavalry squadron can't go on the march without women." And the sergeant major gave a sly wink. "That's very true," Alexei was forced to agree, looking down at the ground. For an instant, in the dark recesses of his dream, 2 dark eyes and birthmarks on a smooth cheek flashed across his mind. He grunted in embarrassment, and the Sergeant Major continued his story. "Right, sir," St. Peter says at once. "I must report this." So off he goes. When he comes back, he says, "All right, we can sort something out." And it's not possible to describe how happy that makes us. But then it turns out there's a little problem. The Apostle tells us we have to wait, but in fact we don't have to wait for more than a minute. I look up, and who should I see? And the Sergeant Major pointed at the silent and proud figure of Nye Tours, walking out of the dream into the mysterious darkness without leaving a trace. "I see the squadron commander trotting up on his horse, Thief of Ticino, and then a little behind him comes an unknown young cadet on foot." At this point in his story, the Sergeant Major gave the doctor a sideways glance, then looked down at the ground for a moment. It was as if he wanted to hide something from the doctor, but it was clearly not anything sad. On the contrary, it was a wonderful secret that made him very happy. Then, recollecting himself, he went on with his story. "So, Peter looks at us, shielding his eyes with his hand, and says, 'Right, that's everything.' And immediately the door is flung open, and he orders us to ride off by the right in 3s. And suddenly, as if in a dream, the air is filled with the sound of metallic voices singing in chorus, accompanied by an Italian accordion. 'Oh, dunka, 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 Dunya, my darling girl. Keep in step,' shout the troop commanders in various different voices. 'Oh, Dunya, 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 love me, do.' And the chorus of voices dies away in the distance." "So, you managed to get in with the women?" gasped Turbin. The Sergeant Major burst out in excited laughter and waved his arms about in joy. "Good God, Doctor, there's just so much space there, you know. And it's all so clean. At first glance you might say you could accommodate 5 whole army corps there, together with their reserve squadrons. Then you realise it could take 10 corps, not 5. And then, gracious me, the church ceilings are so high there you can't see them. So I say, may I ask who all this is for? Because everything's so unusual. The stars and the clouds are red, something like the colour of our shakos." "All this," answers Apostle Peter, "is for the Bolsheviks, those killed at Perikop." "What do you mean, killed at Perikop?" Turbin asked, his mere earthly brain finding this all too difficult to grapple with. "This is because they know about these things in advance, Your Honour. In 1920, masses of Bolsheviks will be killed taking Perikop, so they have prepared accommodation to receive them." "Bolsheviks?" Turbin exclaimed indignantly. "You must be mistaken, Gilin. That can't be right. They wouldn't be admitted there." "That's just what I thought, Doctor, sir. Just what I thought. So, confused, I asked God." "God? Oh, Gilin." "You must believe me, Doctor, I'm speaking the truth. Why should I lie to you? I've spoken to God more than once." "What's he like?" Gilin's eyes radiated light, and his face adopted an expression of pride. "For the life of me, I can't explain. His face is like aspen, but more than that it's impossible to say. At times you look at him and you grow cold. It seems that he is exactly like you or me. You're seized with such a feeling of terror that you wonder what's happening. And then, suddenly, it's all right. You're back to normal. His face varies, but there's such a sense of joy, of happiness. And then there's this blue light. No, it's not blue." The Sergeant Major thought for a moment. "I don't know what it is. Anyway, it goes right through you 600 miles away. Well, anyway, I report to him and tell him that his priests say that all Bolsheviks will go to hell. I ask him why they say this. 'The Bolsheviks don't believe in you,' I say, 'and you have cheered them up by promising such accommodation.' 'So they don't believe in me?' he asks. 'My true Lord God,' I say, afraid you understand to be saying such things to God, but when I look at him he's smiling. What a fool I am. Why am I bothering to tell him such things when he already knows everything better than I do? Yet I'm curious to find out what he'll say, and he says, 'Well, if they don't believe in me, there's nothing you can do about it. Let them believe what they like. Either way it leaves me indifferent, neither hot nor cold. That applies to you as well as to them. I neither gain nor lose from your belief in me. Some people believe, others not.
but everyone behaves the same. At the moment, you're all at each other's throats. As for the accommodation, Jilin, you should understand that insofar as I am concerned, everyone killed on the field of battle is equal. You need to understand that, Jilin. Not everyone does. But in general, Jilin, don't concern yourself with such questions. Just live and enjoy yourself. A full explanation, eh, Doctor? But what about the priests, I ask? He makes a dismissive gesture. It would be better, Jilin, he says, not to remind me about the priests. I won't spend sleepless nights wondering what to do with them. There's no more idiotic group of people on earth than these priests of yours. In confidence, Jilin, they're a disgrace. Not priests at all. Well, Lord, I say, you should dismiss the lot of them. Why bother to feed such parasites? The fact is, Jilin, I feel pity for them, he replies. The aura of radiance around Jilin turned blue, and the sleeping Alexei's heart was filled with inexpressible joy. Stretching out his arms towards the radiant Sergeant Major, he started groaning in his sleep. Jilin, oh Jilin, could you not somehow organize it so that I can serve as a doctor in your brigade? Jilin waved his hand in greeting, and gently and firmly shook his head. Then he began to back away and move out of Alexei Vasilyevich's dream. Alexei woke up, seeing in front of him not Jilin, but the outline of the window growing gradually pale in the dawn light. The doctor wiped his face with his hand, feeling it moist with tears. He lay there in the dawn light for a long time, sighing. Soon, however, he was asleep again, and this time it was an uneventful, dreamless sleep. No, sir. Death was not slow in coming. As autumn turned to winter, it came along the Ukrainian roads, together with the dry, drifting snow. It began to show itself in the woods with the rattle of machine-gun fire. Death itself remained invisible, but it was clearly preceded by an outburst of unbridled peasant fury, running howling and out of control through the blizzards and the cold, wearing torn bast shoes and with hay in its unkempt hair. In its hand it carried a huge club, without which no enterprise in Russia is undertaken. The red roosters started to crow, and in the dying crimson sunset, the genitalia of Jewish innkeepers were hung up for all to see. And in Poland's beautiful capital, Warsaw, a vision of Henryk Sienkiewicz appeared, standing in the clouds with a spiteful smirk on his face. Then all hell simply broke loose, with bubbles expanding everywhere and leaping around in the air. The priests rang the bells under the green cupolas of endangered little churches, and revolutionary songs could be heard coming from nearby schools, their windows shattered by bullets. And along the roads came the ghost of old man Degtyarenko, reeking of homemade vodka and croaking terrifying words that formed on his dark lips, seeming to suggest something extraordinarily like a declaration of human and civil rights. And then this prophet Degtyarenko was lying on the ground, howling, while men with red ribbons on their chest were lashing out at him with ramrods. And even the subtlest mind could not cope with this paradox. If it's red ribbons, then ramrods are out of the question. But if it's ramrods, then red ribbons are impossible. Yes, you could definitely suffocate at such a time and in such a country. Never mind. Let it go to hell. It's all a myth, anyway. Petliura's nothing but a myth. He never existed at all. It was a myth every bit as remarkable as the myth concerning the non-existence of Napoleon, but far less pleasant. Then something else happened. That very same peasant fury had to be induced to travel along a certain road, for things are so magically organized on this earth that no matter how far fury travels, it always ends up by finding itself at the same fatal crossroads. It was all very simple. There would be chaos, but people would be found who would be able to deal with it. And then, from out of the blue, Colonel Toropets appeared. Toropets had apparently served with none other than the Austrian army. How is that possible? I assure you it's true. Then the writer Vinichenko appeared on the scene, famous for two things, for his novels and for the fact that it was only the magical wave of early 1918 that had thrust him to the surface of the seething Ukrainian ocean. Not wasting a second, the St. Petersburg satirical journals called him a traitor. Serves him right.
Perhaps. I don't know. And then there's that mysterious prisoner released from the town jail. Back in September, nobody in the city could have imagined what 3 individuals possessing the talent to be in the right place at the right time could be hatching up, even in such an insignificant little place as Belaya Tserkov. By October, however, people had a strong idea of what might be happening. Trains, their hundreds of windows blazing with light, began to leave the city's passenger railway station number 1, taking the new but still broad-gauge railway line through newly established Poland and on to Germany. Telegrams flew everywhere. Away went diamonds, shifty eyes, slick partings, and money. People fled southwards, too, to the seaport of Odessa, and alas, by November, everybody had become very familiar with the name Petliura. It was everywhere, jumping out at you from every wall, from grey telegraph messages. In the mornings, it dripped down into the coffee from newspaper pages, and the divine tropical beverage immediately turned into the foulest stinking slops in one's mouth. It tripped around on everyone's tongue and was tapped out on keys by operators on Morse telegraph machines. The city became witness to strange and wonderful events connected with this strange, enigmatic word, which the Germans had taken to pronouncing as Petura. There were individual cases of German soldiers who had acquired the lamentable habit of roaming around the city's suburbs and disappearing at night. They disappeared at night, and, during the day, it became clear that they had been murdered. As a result, the Germans started patrolling the streets in steel, basin-shaped helmets. They marched about, telling everyone to behave themselves in the glow of the street lamps. But no street lamp could disperse the chaotic mess that was inside people's heads. Wilhelm. Wilhelm. Yesterday, 3 German soldiers were murdered. Are you aware that the Germans are leaving, for heaven's sake? Trotsky arrested by workers in Moscow. Some sons of bitches have waylaid a train near Borodyanka and helped themselves to everything. Petliura has sent a mission to Paris. Wilhelm again. Black Senegalese troops in Odessa. The unknown mysterious name of Consul Enno. Odessa. Odessa. General Denikin. Wilhelm again. The Germans will leave, the French will come. It's the Bolsheviks who'll come, old chap. Keep your trap shut, old man. The Germans have this contraption with a pointer. Place the contraption on the ground, and the pointer will tell you where a weapon is buried. That's something, isn't it? Petliura has sent a mission to the Bolsheviks. That's something else again, isn't it? Petliura, 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 Petura. Nobody, not a single person, knew what this Petura actually had in mind for the Ukraine, but absolutely everyone knew that he was a mysterious and faceless figure. Every so often, however, the newspapers published a photograph of a Catholic prelate they were sent, each one different, but each signed Simon Petliura. And people knew for sure that this mysterious and faceless figure wanted to conquer the Ukraine, and that in order to be able to do that, he would enter the city and take it. Chapter 6. Madame Anjou's boutique, Chic de Paris, was situated on the ground floor of a huge multi-storied house in the very centre of the city, on Theatre Street, behind the Opera House. Entrance into the boutique was gained through a glass door at the top of 3 steps leading from the street. On either side of the glass door were 2 windows hung with dusty tulle curtains. Nobody knew the whereabouts of Madame Anjou, and as a consequence her boutique was being used for purposes quite other than commercial. In the left-hand window someone had drawn a picture of a colourful lady's hat with the words Chic Parisien written in gold letters, while in the right-hand window there was a huge yellow cardboard poster depicting 2 crossed Sevastopol cannon similar to those on the epaulets of artillery officers, with the following words written above. You might not be a hero, but you are obliged to enlist as a volunteer. And underneath the cannon, enrolment of volunteers in the mortar battalion, named after the commanding officer, now taking place. At the entrance to the boutique there was a blackened and partially dismantled motorcycle and sidecar. Every other minute the entrance door, which was on a spring, banged shut, and each time it opened again,
The doorbell rang magnificently. Ring, ring, reminding people of recent and happier times when Madame Anjou was in charge. Alexei Turbin, Myshlaevsky, and Karas got up at practically the same time after their night of drinking, with, to their astonishment, completely clear heads. Although it is true they all got up fairly late, around midday. Nikolka and Chervinsky had clearly already left the house. Nikolka had hastily wrapped up a mysterious little red bundle and, muttering to himself, had gone off to join his unit. A few minutes before, Chervinsky had left for army headquarters. Myshlaevsky stood stripped to the waist in Anuta's cherished little room behind the kitchen with a wash basin and bath hidden by a curtain. He doused his back, neck, and head with icy cold water and shouted out with a shriek of horrified delight. "Hey, that's wonderful!" He yelled so loudly that it could be heard for many yards around. Then he dried himself with a rough towel, dressed, brilliantined and combed his hair, and said to Alexei, "Alyosha, be a good chap and lend me your spurs. I won't have time to go home, and I don't want to turn up without any spurs." "You'll find them in the study, in the desk, right-hand drawer." Myshlaevsky went to the study, where he clattered around for a bit, then came out again, his spurs jingling. Black-eyed Anyuta, who had returned that morning after spending her day off with her aunt, was busy dusting the chairs with a feather duster. Myshlaevsky cleared his throat, gave a sideways glance at the door, and started to adopt a more circuitous route, making a detour towards Anyutachka. "Hello, Anyutachka." "I'll tell Yelena Vasilievna," Anyuta whispered quickly and mechanically, without a second thought, and closed her eyes like an intended victim, waiting for someone to stab her. "You silly little—" At that moment, Alexei unexpectedly poked his head round the door. His face was as dark as thunder. "You see that brush, Vitya? Right. It's lovely, isn't it? I would get out of here now if I were you. And you, Anyuta, you need to bear in mind that if he starts talking about marriage, don't believe a word of it." "Good God! Can't a fellow simply say hello to someone?" Smarting from the undeserved insult, Myshlaevsky puffed out his chest and left the sitting room, his spurs clattering. In the dining room, he went up to lovely golden Yelena, his eyes expressing a certain alarm. "Hello, Yelena, my beautiful girl. May I wish you, a very good morning." He spoke in a hoarse baritone voice instead of his usual clear and strong tenor. "Lena, my beautiful girl," he exclaimed, his voice full of emotion. "Don't be angry with me. I love you, and you must love me. Don't pay any attention to those boorish remarks yesterday. You don't really think I'm a bastard, do you, Lena?" Saying this, he flung his arms round Yelena and kissed her on both cheeks. In the sitting room, Anyuta's brush, in the form of a coxcomb, fell on the floor with a gentle thud. Strange things always happened to Anyuta whenever Myshlaevsky made an appearance in the Turbins' apartment. Household objects started spilling out of her hands. Knives would crash down, and if she was in the kitchen, dishes would fall off the stand on the sideboard. Anushka would become distracted, suddenly running out of the kitchen, and busy herself with the galoshes, wiping them with a rag until she could hear the clinking of short spurs set well down on the heels. Then, when Myshlaevsky's broad shoulders, sloping chin, and blue breeches appeared, Anyuta would close her eyes and sidle out from her cramped, cunning little hiding place. And now, in the sitting room, having dropped the brush, she stood for a long time lost in thought, looking through the patterned curtains at the grey, cloudy sky in the distance. "Vitka, Vitka," Yelena said, shaking her head, with its shining crown of hair resembling a theatre prop. "Just look at you, a perfectly healthy young man, and yet your behaviour last night. Sit down and have some tea. Perhaps you'll feel better." "Do you know how absolutely gorgeous you look today, Lenochka? And I swear, your housecoat fits you so well," Myshlaevsky said ingratiatingly, glancing into the mirrored depths of the sideboard. "Look, Karas, what a fantastic housecoat! Such a beautiful green, isn't it?" "Yes, Yelena Vasilievna, you're looking very beautiful," Karas answered seriously and sincerely. "It's actually electric blue," clarified Yelena. Anyway, Vitya, why don't you get straight to the point and tell me what's wrong? The fact is, Lena, my beautiful girl, that after what happened to me yesterday, I'm liable to have a migraine, and nobody is able to fight with a migraine. All right, then. Look in the sideboard. Thank you. Thank you. Just one little glass. Better than any aspirin. Screwing up his eyes from the pain of it all, Myshlaevsky downed 2 tumblers of vodka, one after the other, taking them with limp gherkins left over from the evening before. Then he declaimed he felt as good as new, and expressed the wish for some tea with lemon. "Don't worry about me, Leonochka," Alexei said hoarsely. "I'm just going to enlist, and then I'll be straight back. And don't worry about any possible military action. We'll just wait in the city and repel any attack by that so-called president, the bastard." "Yes, but won't you be sent somewhere?" Karas shook his head reassuringly. "No, don't worry, Yelena Vasilievna. Listen, in the first place, under no circumstances will the battalion be ready for action for at least 2 weeks. We still don't have any horses or ammunition. And secondly, even when it is ready, we shall definitely stay in the city anyway. The entire army, which is now in the process of formation, will be the city's garrison. Maybe a little later, when we have to advance on Moscow. But that may never happen. We shall need to join up with Denikin rather earlier. You don't need to console me, gentlemen. I'm not afraid of anything at all. On the contrary, I approve of your intentions." Yelena indeed sounded cheerful, and the expression in her eyes indicated that her interest had already turned to matters of domestic concern. "Sufficient unto the day be the evil thereof." "Anyuta," she shouted, "out on the veranda you'll find Viktor Viktorovitch's washing. Take it, will you? Give it a good brushing and then wash it straight away." Most reassuring of all, from Yelena's point of view, was the small, compact figure of blue-eyed Karas. The assured Karas sat there in his light brown army jacket, his eyes screwed up slightly, smoking and looking calm and nonchalant. They said goodbye in the hall. "May God keep and preserve you," Yelena said solemnly, and made the sign of the cross over Alexei, then over Karas and Myshlaevsky. Myshlaevsky embraced her, and Karas, his greatcoat belted tightly round his waist, blushed as he tenderly kissed her on both hands. "Permission to report, Colonel, sir," Karas said with a salute and gentle click of his spurs. The colonel sat at a small desk in a low green lounge chair raised up on a kind of dais in the right-hand side of the shop. Behind him towered piles of blue cardboard boxes bearing the inscription Madame Anjou, Ladies' Millinery, somewhat dimming the light coming from the dusty window hung with a patterned tulle curtain. The colonel had a pen in his hand. In actual fact, he wasn't a full colonel, but just a lieutenant colonel with broad gold epaulets, 2 stripes, 3 stars, and crossed gold cannon. The colonel was a little older than Alexei Turbin, about 30 years old, certainly no more than 32. His sleek, clean-shaven face sported a black moustache, trimmed after the American fashion. Although he was clearly tired, the expression in his eyes was lively, thoughtful, and aware. The colonel was surrounded by primordial chaos. A couple of yards away, a fire was crackling in a small black stove, with a black, knobbly flue, occasionally dripping globules of black gunge as it snaked away over the partition and disappeared into the depths of the shop. Scraps of paper and red and green material cuttings littered the floor, not only on the raised platform, but also in the rest of the shop, extending into the recesses at the back. High up, right above the colonel's head, someone could be heard clucking away at a typewriter, like the alarm call of an anxious bird. When Turbin looked up, he saw that the sound was coming from behind a railing suspended right under the shop's ceiling. Someone's feet and rear in blue riding breeches could be seen behind the railing, but the head was invisible because the ceiling intervened. To the left, another machine was clattering away in an invisible pit in the floor, revealing only the bright epaulettes and blonde head of a volunteer, but neither his arms nor his legs. A multitude of faces and gold epaulettes with cannon flitted around the colonel. Nearby stood a large box with telephone receivers and wires, and next to the piles of hat boxes lay several coiled machine-gun belts and a number of hand grenades, looking like tins of preserves with wooden handles. A sewing machine with a treadle stood under the colonel's left elbow, and by his right foot protruded the snout of a machine gun. Somewhere in the depths and semi-darkness, behind a curtain hanging from a gleaming rail, a voice could be heard on the telephone, clearly under pressure. "Yes, yes, speaking. Yes, yes, I'm telling you, yes!" Ring, ring went the bell, and what sounded like a small bird tweeting came from the invisible pit, as a young bass voice mumbled, "Battalion headquarters here. Yes, yes." "How can I help you?" the colonel asked Karas. "Permit me to introduce you, Colonel, sir, to Lieutenant Viktor Mishlaevsky and Dr. Turbin. Lieutenant Mishlaevsky is serving at present in the 2nd Infantry Unit as a private, and wishes to transfer to the battalion under your command as an artillery officer. Dr. Turbin requests appointment as a battalion medical officer." When he had finished speaking, Karas lowered his hand from the salute position, whereupon Mishlaevsky saluted. "Damn it, I wish I were in uniform," Alexei thought irritably, feeling awkward without a cap, dressed like some dolt in a black coat with a lambskin collar. The colonel's eyes flitted over the doctor, then across to Mishlaevsky's face and greatcoat. "Right, that's excellent," he said. "And what unit were you with, Lieutenant?" "A heavy battalion, Colonel," answered Mishlaevsky, referring to his position during the war with Germany. "A heavy battalion, you say? That's very good indeed. The devil knows what they're doing shoving artillery officers into the infantry. What a mess!" "Not at all, Colonel, sir," Mishlaevsky replied, masking his challenging tone of voice with a little cough. "I myself volunteered to join the infantry detachment when there was an urgent demand for troops to go to Postvolinsky, but now that the detachment is fully up to strength—" "Very good. That meets with my complete approval," the colonel said, and indeed the expression in his eyes as he looked at Mishlaevsky was one of complete approval. "I'm pleased to have met you. So, Doctor, you'd like to join us too?" Turbin silently inclined his head, so as to avoid having to say, "Yes, sir," dressed as he was in only his coat with its lamb collar. The colonel said, glancing out of the window. "That's a very good idea, you know, especially since sooner or later we may— Right." He suddenly broke off, screwing up his eyes slightly, and then continued more quietly. "It's just that— how can I put it? There is one little matter, social theories and all that. You are a socialist, aren't you? Like all members of the intelligentsia?" The colonel's eyes slid sideways. His whole manner, his lips, and his honeyed tone of voice expressed just how much he indeed wanted Turbin to be socialist, rather than anything else. "Our battalion is called the Students' Battalion," the colonel said with an emotional smile, averting his eyes. "A little sentimental, of course, but I myself am a university man." Turbin was extremely disappointed and astonished at this. "What has Karas been saying, damn it?" he thought, sensing at that moment Karas standing to his right. Without looking, he realized that Karas urgently wanted to communicate something, but it was impossible to know exactly what it was. "I regret," Turbin suddenly blurted out, his cheek twitching, "that I am not a socialist, but a monarchist. And I have to say, the very word socialist is anathema to me. And of all socialists, I hate Alexander Fyodorovich Kerensky most of all." From behind his right shoulder, he heard a sound coming from Karas's lips. It would be very sad not to be with Karas and Vitya, he thought. But the devil take this socialist battalion. Damn it! The colonel glanced down fleetingly, and there was a sparkle in his eyes. He gestured to Turbin as if to indicate politely that he should keep his mouth shut. "That's a pity," he said. A great pity. Achievements of the revolution and so on. I have orders from above not to accept any monarchist elements. The population as a whole needs restraint, you understand. Moreover, the hetman, with whom we are in the most immediate and direct contact, has, you know— a pity, a great pity." As he said this, the colonel's voice not only did not contain any note of regret, but on the contrary, he sounded positively pleased, and his eyes expressed the exact opposite of what he was saying. "Aha," thought Turbin, understanding the position perfectly. "I am an idiot, and the colonel is far from stupid. Judging by his face, he's probably a careerist, but I don't mind that." I don't know now what's the best thing to do. At the present moment, as you know, said the colonel, particularly emphasizing the word present, I repeat, at the present moment, our most immediate task is to defend the city and the hetman from Petliura's gang, as well as possibly from the Bolsheviks. We'll just have to wait and see. Where did you serve, Doctor, before this, may I ask? In 1915, after graduation, I worked as a junior doctor in a clinic for venereal diseases, and then as a medical officer with the Belgrade Hussars, and after that in a mobile field hospital. At the present moment I am demobilized, and have my own private practice. Cadet, the colonel ordered, ask the senior officer to report to me. A head disappeared down into the pit, followed by the appearance of a young, dark-skinned, lively-looking and eager officer wearing a lambskin fur cap with a purple striped top and a grey greatcoat a la Mishlaevsky with a tightly fastened belt and a revolver. His crumpled gold epaulets indicated that he was a staff captain. Captain Studzinski, the colonel said to the young officer, be so kind as to send a message to headquarters requesting the immediate transfer to me of Lieutenant, Mishlaevsky, said Mishlaevsky, saluting. Lieutenant Mishlaevsky from the 2nd Infantry Detachment as an artillery officer, and with it, a message concerning Dr. Turbin. Dr. Turbin. I would very much like him to become battalion medical officer. Please request that he be appointed immediately. Yes, Colonel, sir, answered the officer in a foreign accent, and saluted. A Pole, thought Turbin. You, Lieutenant, should not return to your infantry unit, the colonel said to Mishlaevsky. Then, turning to the captain, he said, The lieutenant will take over the 4th platoon. Yes, Colonel, sir. Yes, Colonel, sir. As for you, Doctor, as of this moment you are a serving officer. I would like you to report today, within the hour, to the parade ground in front of the Alexandrovsky High School. Yes, Colonel, sir. Issue the doctor with the uniform immediately. Yes, sir. Yes, sir, shouted the bass voice from the pit. No, do you hear? No, I'm telling you no, came a shout from behind the partition. Ring, cheep, cheep, chirped the bird down in the pit. Can you hear me? Liberty News! Liberty News! Your new daily, Liberty News! Shouted the newspaper boy, his hair wrapped in a woman's scarf. Petliura demoralized! African troops arrive in Odessa! Liberty News! Within an hour, Turbin was back home. The silver epaulets were located in the depths of the drawer in Turbin's study, next to the sitting room. The study itself was sparsely furnished and rather cramped, but nonetheless comfortable. There were white curtains on the glass door, opening out onto a balcony, a desk with books and an inkwell, shelves of medicine bottles and instruments, and a couch made up with a clean sheet. Leonuchka, if for some reason I'm back late today and someone comes, tell them there's no surgery. It won't be any of my regular patients. Quick as you can, my girl. Having turned back the lapels of Turbin's army jacket, Yelena was hastily sewing on the epaulets. She had already sewn the others, khaki green with a black stripe, onto the greatcoat. A few minutes later, Turbin dashed out of the front door, glancing at the white board on the way. Dr. A.V. Turbin, Venereal Diseases and Syphilis, 606-914. Surgery hours, 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. Sticking on the amended times of 5 p.m. to 7 p.m., he set off up St. Alexei's Hill at a run. Liberty News! Turbin stopped, bought a copy, and continued on his way, opening the paper as he went. Independent Democratic Newspaper, published daily, 13th of December 1918. Issues relating to external trade, and in particular trade with Germany, compel us... But where on earth is it? My hands are freezing. According to our correspondent, negotiations are taking place in Odessa concerning the disembarkation of 2 divisions of black colonial troops. Consul Enno rejects any suggestion that... The son of a bitch, that newspaper lad. Deserters who turned up yesterday at army headquarters at Postvolinsky have spoken of the increasing demoralization in the ranks of Petliura's forces. 2 days ago, a cavalry regiment in the Korosten region fired on an infantry regiment of Cossack riflemen. Among Petliura's forces, a strong desire for peace has been observed. Petliura's little adventure is clearly coming to an end.
According to the same source, Colonel Bolbotun has rebelled against Petliura and gone off with his regiment and 4 guns to an unknown destination. Bolbotun inclines towards support of the hetman. The peasants hate Petliura for his requisitions. The mobilization orders he has published in the villages have had no success. The peasants are ignoring them in their masses by taking to hiding in the forests. It's possible, I suppose. Oh, damn this bloody frost. Sorry. There's no need to push like that, my dear sir. Newspapers should be read at home. Sorry. We have always maintained that Petliura's little adventure— What a bastard! Oh, you bastard! Don't let Petliura have his way! Come join the volunteers today! Why so glum today, Ivan Ivanovitch? My wife's gone down with Petliura. She did a Bolbotun on me this morning. Hearing this witticism, Turbin's expression changed, and he angrily scrunched up the newspaper and hurled it onto the pavement. Then, suddenly, his attention was caught by the boom-boom of heavy gunfire, followed by a series of dull thuds coming seemingly from the depths of the earth, from somewhere outside the city. What the devil's that? Turbin turned abruptly, picked up the crumpled ball of newspaper, straightened it out, and read through the first page again more carefully. In the Irpin region, there have been clashes between our advanced forces and individual groups of Petliura's bandits. All reported calm in the Serebryansk area. No change at the Red Tavern. In the Boyak area, a fierce attack by a regiment of Hetmanite Cossacks has dispersed a group some 1,500 strong. 2 men taken prisoner. The roar of gunfire could also be heard in the grey winter sky, somewhere to the far southwest of the city. Turbin suddenly turned pale, his mouth open. Mechanically, he stuffed the newspaper into his pocket. Crowds of people were moving slowly from the boulevard and along Vladimirskaya Street. Many people in black coats were walking directly on the road, while peasant women could be glimpsed on the pavement. A horseman of the State Guard rode commandingly along. His large horse, its ears twitching, looked around nervously as it moved sideways along the road. The rider seemed rather confused. From time to time he would shout something, brandishing his whip to show who he was, but nobody paid any attention. At the front of the crowd, the gold copes of bearded priests could be seen bobbing along, a religious banner waving above their heads. Small boys were dashing up from all directions. "News!" shouted a newspaper boy, making a beeline for the crowd. Sous-chefs in their white, flat-topped hats ran out from the dark interior of the Metropole restaurant. The crowd spread out over the snow like black ink over paper. A number of long yellow boxes were swaying along above the heads of the crowd. When the first box drew level with Turbin, he was able to make out the charcoal inscription scrawled on its side, Ensign Yutsevich. On the second box, Ensign Ivanov, and on the third, Ensign Orlov. Suddenly, there was a howl from the crowd. A grey-haired woman, her hat on the back of her head, dashed from the pavement into the crowd, stumbling and dropping various packages along the way. "What's going on? Vanya!" she yelled. Someone turned pale and ran off to one side. A peasant woman started howling, followed by another behind her. "Lord Jesus Christ!" Turbin heard someone mutter behind him. Someone pushed him in the back, and he could sense someone's breath on his neck. "Lord, what terrible times we're living in. So people are being killed now, is that it?" "I don't know anything except what I can see here in front of me." What's going on? Who's being buried?" "Vanya!" someone yelled in the crowd. "They're the officers who were murdered in Popolyucha," a voice boomed hastily, anxious to be the first with the news. "They had got as far as Popolyucha, where they spent the night, but some peasants, together with a group of Petliura's men, surrounded them and simply slaughtered them. Yes, just like that. Slaughtered. Their eyes were gouged out, and their epaulets carved onto their shoulders. Completely mutilated." "Oh, my God! So that's what happened." 2 more yellow coffins went by. Ensign Korovin. Ensign Gert. "What times we're living in, just think." "Internecine fighting." "What on earth do you mean?" "They fell asleep, apparently." "Serves them right," someone hissed darkly behind Turbin, and he immediately saw red.
Faces and caps flashed past. Turbin thrust his hand between two necks and grasped the sleeve of the man's black coat in a pincer-like grip. The man turned round with a horrified look. "What did you say?" Turbin hissed, relaxing his grip. "Please, sir, I beg you," the man answered, shaking with fright. "I didn't say anything. I didn't open my mouth. What do you want?" he asked, his voice quavering. The man's beak-like nose paled, and Turbin realized at once he'd made a mistake. He'd seized hold of the wrong man. The beak-like nose belonged to a face expressing nothing but the best of intentions. Its mouth was unable to speak, and its eyes were rolling from terror. Turbin let go of the man's sleeve, and in cold fury began looking around at everybody, searching among the seething mass of caps, heads, and collars. His left hand was poised to grab, and his right hand was in his pocket, firmly holding onto the handle of his Browning revolver. The priests walked past, singing mournfully, and a woman in a shawl sobbed. The man he was looking for seemed to have vanished into thin air, so there was nobody he could grab. The last coffin floated by. Ensign Morskoy. Several sledges went past at speed. "News!" somebody shouted in a hoarse falsetto right by Turbin's ear. Turbin pulled out the crumpled newspaper from his pocket and, without thinking what he was doing, jabbed it twice into the newspaper boy's face. "Here's your news for you," he said, grinding his teeth. "Here's your news, you little swine." As soon as he'd said this, Turbin's fit of rage left him. Dropping his newspapers, the lad slipped and sat down in a snowdrift. His face puckered up, and he began to weep patently false tears, but the expression in his eyes was one of undiluted and far from false hatred. "Why did you do that? What have I done?" the lad whined in an attempt at a wail, and started digging into the snow. Someone looked at Turbin in astonishment, but he was afraid to say anything. Feeling ashamed and aware of the absurdity of what he'd done, Turbin tucked his head into his shoulders and, turning sharply, ran from the street onto the huge familiar square in the park of the Alexandrovsky High School, past the gas lamp, past the white wall on the side of the large circular museum building, and past several pits in the ground filled with snow-covered bricks. Behind him he could still hear the shouts from the street. "News! Daily Democratic newspaper!" The huge, peaceful edifice of the school that Turbin knew so well, with its 4 stories and its 180 columns, stood along one side of the square. Turbin had spent 8 years as a student there. Every spring for 8 years, during the breaks between classes, he had run around that very same square, and in the winter, when the classrooms were full of choking dust and the square was covered in a cold, solid mass of snow, he used to stand at the window looking out onto it. For 8 years within these peaceful brick walls, Turbin and his younger fellow pupils, Karas and Mishlaevsky, had been educated and nurtured. And it was exactly 8 years ago that Turbin had last seen the school park. For some reason, his heart contracted from fear. A black cloud suddenly seemed to have covered the sky, and a tornado had apparently appeared out of nowhere and wiped his life away, just like a huge wave washing away a jetty. 8 years as a student. How many absurdities, how much sorrow and despair had he lived through as a small boy. And yet, how happy he had been too. One grey day after another, on and on. Like Julius Caesar, he had been given the lowest possible mark for cosmography, and from then on he had always hated the subject. But then there was the spring. Springtime, with noisy, echoing classrooms, the girl pupils walking along the boulevards in their green pinafores, the chestnuts in May, and above all, the ever-present lighthouse pointing the way ahead, to university, to freedom and life, in other words. Do you understand the significance of that word, university? Sunsets over the Dnieper, freedom, money, the life force, and fame. And he had lived through it all. The teachers with their inscrutable expressions, the swimming pools, still featuring in his dreams, from which the water always seemed to be draining, but which always remained full, and the endless discussions concerning the difference in character between Liensky and Onyegin, Socrates' scandalous behaviour, when the Order of Jesuits was founded, the dates of Pompey's campaign, and of someone else's campaign, and of campaign after campaign over 2,000 years of history. But this was far from all. After 8 years of school, with the swimming pools left far behind, came the corpses in the anatomy theatre, the whitewashed hospital wards, the glassy silence of the operating theatres, and then 3 years being tossed about in the saddle, the dressing of wounds, the humiliations, and the suffering. Oh, the damned cesspit of war. And here he was once again, back in the same old school grounds, running across the square, feeling ill and overwrought, clutching the Browning in his pocket, running God knows where and what for. Probably to protect that very same life, that future for whose sake he had worried himself sick over swimming pools and those blasted pedestrians, one setting off from point A and the other setting off to meet him from point B. The blackened windows of the school seemed frozen in complete gloom. It was immediately apparent that their stillness was that of the grave. It seemed very strange that in the centre of a city, in the midst of all the chaos, bustle and commotion, there should be this dead, four-tiered ship that had once carried scores of thousands of lives onto the open sea. It seemed that nobody was looking after it any longer, and that there was neither sound nor movement of any kind in its windows and under its walls, decorated with yellow paint dating from the time of Nicholas II. A layer of virgin snow covered the roofs, crowned the tops of the chestnut trees, and spread evenly over the square. Only a few tracks showed that someone had recently crossed it. But the main point was that not only did nobody know what had happened to everything, but that nobody cared. Nobody cared who was still studying here in this ship, or if there weren't any students any more, why that should be so, or where the watchman might be. Why were there those fearful-looking, blunt-snouted mortars protruding from under the line of chestnuts by the railing? Why was there a weapons store in the school? Whose was it? Who? What for? Nobody knew the answers to these questions, just as nobody knew what had become of Madame Anjou, and why there were bombs in her boutique lying beside the empty hat-boxes. "Deploy!" someone roared, and the mortars began to move and creep slowly forward. About 200 people were busy running in various directions, squatting down and leaping about near the huge metal wheels of the mortars. There were glimpses of yellow sheepskin coats, grey greatcoats, and fur caps, military, khaki, and blue students' caps. Turbin walked across the imposing square to find the 4 mortars in a row, gaping at him. The hurried drill procedure around the guns had ended, and the motley, recently recruited soldiers of the mortar battalion stood to attention in 2 ranks. "Captain!" sang out Myshlaevsky's voice. "Platoon present and correct, sir." Captain Studzinski stepped out in front of the ranks of soldiers, took a step backwards, and shouted, "By the left! Quick march!" The ranks swayed and marched off raggedly, the snow crunching under their feet. As they marched by, Turbin glimpsed many familiar, typical student faces, including that of Karas at the head of the 3rd platoon. Still uncertain where he was going and for what purpose, he started crunching through the snow in step with the platoon. Karas, concerned that his platoon was out of step, went out in front of his men and, walking backwards, shouted, "Left! Left! Hup! Left!" The company snaked towards the dark basement entrance to the school. One after the other, the ranks of soldiers were swallowed up by its black maw. The interior of the school was even more lifeless and gloomy than its exterior. The crashing echo of marching feet quickly brought the stone walls and eerie darkness to life. Strange sounds began to fly around under the vaults like animated demons. With the ponderous sound of marching feet came the squeak of alarmed rats scuttling about under the floorboards. The company marched along endless, dark, brick-paved basement corridors until they came to a huge hall lit by a miserly light trickling through narrow barred windows and musty cobwebs. The silence was broken by the hellish din of hammers. People were opening boxes of shells, removing seemingly endless numbers of cartridge belts, together with round cartridge cases for Lewis guns, looking like cream cakes. Grey and black machine guns emerged, resembling evil-looking mosquitoes. There was a clattering of nuts and bolts, a ripping of pliers, and, over in the corner, the high-pitched whine of a saw. Cadets were unloading piles of frozen and sorry-looking fur caps, folded greatcoats that were as rigid as iron, belts that had become stiff, cartridge pouches, and water bottles wrapped in cloth.
"Look lively there,"
Studzinski could be heard saying. A group of about 6 officers in faded gold epaulets swirled around the room like club moss on top of a pond. Mishlaevsky's strong tenor voice was singing some song or other.
"Doctor,"
Studzinski shouted from out of the gloom,
"please be so kind as to take the medical assistants and give them their instructions."
2 students appeared in front of Turbin. One of them, short and agitated, had a red cross on the sleeve of his student coat. The other was wearing a grey coat and a fur cap that he kept on having to adjust because it was slipping down over his eyes. "The boxes of medical supplies are over there," Turbin said. "Take the shoulder satchels out and give me my doctor's bag and equipment. Make sure you give each artilleryman 2 of the individual medical packs with a brief explanation how they are to open them in an emergency." Mishlaevsky's head emerged above the seething mass of soldiers. He climbed up onto a box, took his rifle, pulled back the bolt, and slamming in a cartridge clip, took aim at the window, pulled back the bolt again, took aim, repeating the action again and again, showering the cadets with expended bullets. The basement began to sound like a factory. With a general din and the clatter of bolts being pulled, the cadets loaded their rifles. "Anybody who can't do it, take care," Mishlaevsky sang out. "Cadets, show the students how it's done." When everyone had pulled the straps of cartridge pouches and shoulder satchels over their heads, it was as if a miracle had taken place. What had been a motley, disparate bunch of men was now a single, compact unit, with a bristling row of bayonets wavering unsteadily over their heads like a steel brush.
"All officers to me, please,"
Studzinski said from out of the darkness. Studzinski addressed them quietly in the dark corridor, to the sound of softly clinking spurs.
"Well, impressions?"
There was a stamping of spurs, and Mishlaevsky, nonchalantly and adeptly placing the tips of his fingers in his cap band, stepped forward towards the staff captain and said, "I have 15 men in my platoon who haven't the first idea how to use a rifle. Makes life difficult." Studzinski looked up, as though inspired, towards the window that was letting in the final feeble ray of light into the basement.
"What about morale?"
he asked. Again it was Mishlaevsky who spoke. Not helped by seeing those coffins. The students were upset. It hit them badly. They saw what was going on through the railings." Studzinski's dark, unwavering eyes flicked over him.
"Do all you can to raise morale."
They all dispersed to the clink of spurs.
"Cadet Pavlovsky!"
roared Mishlaevsky in the armament store, sounding like Radames in Aida. The store's stone walls resounded with the shout of cadets' voices calling for Pavlovsky.
"Here, sir."
"A student of Alexeyevsky Academy?"
"Yes, sir."
"Right then, let's have a song that will blow the roof off. Put such force into it that Petlura will drop dead, damn him to hell." Under the stone-vaulted ceiling, a clear, high voice started singing, "A gunner boy, I was born." This was taken up by several tenor voices from among the forest of bayonets. Taught and nurtured by the brigade, the entire group seemed to tremble with excitement as they all quickly picked up the tune by ear, until suddenly the whole room was echoing with the elemental sound of a bass chorus exploding into song. Baptized by the sound of gunfire, wrapped in lush velvet, and the sound of gunfire. The song rang in everyone's ears and heads, as well as in the boxes of ammunition, and even some dusty glasses standing abandoned on the sloping window ledges trembled and tinkled. In my cradle of anchor ropes, the gun crew rocked me to sleep. Studzinski seized hold of 2 pink-cheeked ensigns from the melee of greatcoats, bayonets, and machine guns.
"Go to the vestibule and take the cover off the painting there, quick as you can,"
he ordered in a hurried whisper, and the 2 of them raced off. The guards' cadets sing as down the street they pound, the trumpets and drums and the cymbals resound. The empty stone shell of the building now thundered and roared to the terrifying sound of a march, and the rats, cowering in their deep underground lairs, were too petrified to move. "Hey up!" Karas shouted shrilly. "Come on, put some life into it, students of Alexeyevsky Academy!" Mishlaevsky yelled in his clear tenor voice. "This isn't a funeral!" The seamstresses, maids, and laundry girls watch the cadets as they march away. Instead of a grey, indeterminate caterpillar shuffling along, an organised troop of men bristling with bayonets moved down the corridor, and the floor bent and groaned under the heavy tread of their feet. They marched along the seemingly endless corridor, then up to the first floor and into the gigantic vestibule, lit by the light streaming through its glass cupola. The first to arrive were already there, waiting a little restlessly. Mounted on his rearing thoroughbred stallion, Emperor Alexander, slightly balding and with a radiant smile, his saddlecloth embellished with imperial monograms, charged along ahead of his troops, his white-feathered tricorn hat cocked to one side. Bestowing smile after smile on them, full of a rather disingenuous charm, Alexander gestured with his baton to show them the regiments who fought at Borodino. The battlefield was strewn with piles of cannonballs, and the entire background of the 14-foot canvas was taken up by a black forest of bayonets. "What a battle it was!" Pavlovsky sang. "Yes, what a battle it was!" thundered the basses. "No Russian will ever forget the glorious day of Borodino." The dazzling Alexander galloped on and upwards towards heaven, with the cover that had concealed the painting for a whole year lying at the feet of his stallion. "Just look at the blessed Tsar Alexander, won't you? Come on, keep in step there. Hup, left, left," yelled Mishlaevsky as the file of troops climbed the staircase with the heavy tread of Tsar Alexander's infantry. Once past the conqueror of Napoleon, the squadron stopped singing as they wheeled into the vast assembly hall and stood there in their dense ranks, bayonets waving. The hall was filled with a whitish, rather gloomy light, and behind the covers over the paintings on the walls, the figures of previous Tsars could be discerned, peering down like pale ghosts onto the assembled company. Studzinski took a step backwards and glanced at his wristwatch. At that moment, a cadet ran up to him and whispered something in his ear. Those standing nearby could hear what he said. "The battalion commander!" Studzinski gestured to his officers, who ran to the ranks and dressed them. Studzinski went out into the corridor to meet the commander. His spurs jingling, Colonel Malishev was climbing the stairs towards the entrance to the assembly hall, turning to glance at the painting of Alexander on the way. His curved Caucasian sabre with its cherry-coloured sword knot dangled at his left side. He was wearing a black cap of luxuriant velvet and a long greatcoat with a huge slit at the back. He was looking thoughtful. Studzinski went quickly up to him and saluted. "They all have uniforms?" asked Malishev. "Yes, sir. All orders have been carried out." "And?" "They will fight, but they're totally lacking in experience. 120 cadets are in charge of 80 students, none of whom knows how to hold a rifle." Malishev frowned, but he said nothing. "I am very fortunate to have such good officers," Studzinski continued, "especially the one who's just joined me, Mishlaevsky. We shall manage somehow." "Right, but now I want you to see to it that the battalion, with the exception of the officers and 60 of the best and most experienced cadets, who will stay behind to guard the mortars, the ammunition store, and the building generally, disperses to their homes to be back here at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning." Studzinski's face expressed blank astonishment. His mouth open, he glared at the colonel with an extremely defiant expression. "But, Colonel, sir—" In his agitation, Studzinski started to stress all his words in the Polish way, on the penultimate syllable. "With all due respect, that will not be possible. The only way the battalion will be able to maintain its fighting readiness will be if it stays here for the night." The colonel there and then demonstrated that he possessed a new quality, the ability to erupt into a fit of rage on the grandest scale. His neck and cheeks turned a brownish red, and his eyes flashed fire. "Captain," he said furiously,
I shall ask that an official complaint be made against you, so that your duties as an officer will cease, and you will become a lecturer whose job will be to instruct senior officers. And I will not find that at all pleasant, as I have always supposed you, of all people, to be an experienced officer, and not a civilian professor. So I don't need to be lectured, and I don't need any advice from you. Listen to what I've been saying and remember it, and then, when you've remembered, you are to carry out my orders." The two of them stood there, glaring at each other. A reddish glow crept over Studzinski's neck and cheeks, and his lips trembled. "Yes, sir," he said gratingly. "Yes, sir. Now send them home. They are to sleep, without their weapons, and then be back here tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock. But that's not all. They are to disperse in small groups, rather than in their platoons, and they are to remove their splendid epaulets, so as not to attract any attention from idle people." A ray of understanding flashed in Studzinski's eyes, and his sense of outrage subsided. "Yes, sir. Colonel, sir.